There's something most people don't talk about when it comes to no contact: the expectation. Not always spoken, not always even fully conscious, but it's there. When communication stops, part of him assumes that eventually you'll be the one to break the silence. Not because he's planning it in a calculated way, but because that's what the pattern has been. You've been the one to reach out, to check in, to keep things from completely fading. So when everything goes quiet, there's an underlying belief that it won't last, that at some point you'll come back. And in the beginning, that expectation keeps him comfortable. The silence doesn't feel permanent to him. It feels temporary, like a pause that you'll eventually end. That's why he may not rush to reach out. Not because he doesn't notice, but because he's used to the idea that you'll close the distance before it gets too real. But this is where everything starts to shift. When you hold your silence, when you resist the urge to send that message, when you choose not to go back to what feels familiar, you break the pattern he was relying on. And once that pattern breaks, the situation becomes different. Because now, the silence isn't something he's waiting for you to fix. It's something he has to face. At first, there may be a delay in that realization. He may continue as if nothing has changed, assuming that you're just taking time or that you'll eventually return. But as the silence continues, that expectation starts to fade, and in its place, something else begins to grow. He starts to notice that you haven't reached out. He starts to recognize that the usual dynamic isn't happening, and that's when the shift becomes real. Because now, instead of being passive, he's being pulled into the experience of the silence. He can't rely on you to maintain the connection anymore. This is where your power comes in, not in chasing, not in explaining, but in your ability to stay consistent in your absence. Because by not reaching out, you're communicating something without saying a word. You're showing that you're not operating from the same place as before. You're no longer driven by the need to keep the connection alive at all costs. And that changes how he sees you. Not because you said anything, but because your actions created a new reality. The version of you who would always reach out is no longer there. And that creates a level of uncertainty that forces him to think differently. So while part of him may have expected you to chase, your silence becomes the moment where everything shifts because you chose not to. When you step into no contact and truly hold that space, something begins to happen that he may never openly admit. He starts to feel your absence. Not just notice it, but actually experience it. Because while you were present, while you were texting, calling, showing up consistently, there was always a sense of access. Even if he didn't fully appreciate it in the moment, it was there. You were there. And that presence over time can become something he unconsciously takes for granted. But when you remove that presence completely, the dynamic changes in a way that can't be ignored. At first, it might not seem like it affects him. He may stay busy, distracted, focused on his own routine. The silence might feel normal in the beginning, especially if he's used to emotional distance or if he assumes you'll eventually reach out again. But as time passes, something subtle begins to shift. The space you once filled becomes noticeable. The consistency you once provided is no longer there. And slowly that absence starts to register. Because absence has a way of creating awareness that presence sometimes cannot. When someone is always there, their value can become invisible. But when they're gone, their impact becomes clear. He starts to remember the small things, the conversations, the attention, the way you showed up. Not because you're reminding him, but because the silence leaves room for those memories to surface on their own. And this is where the emotional experience begins. He doesn't just think about you. He feels the difference. The lack of communication, the shift in energy, the absence of your presence. It all creates a contrast between what was and what is now. And that contrast is what makes your absence powerful. It's not about making him miss you in a manipulative way. It's about allowing him to experience what life feels like without your energy in it. Because when you're always available, there's no space for that realization to happen. But when you step back, when you stop filling that space, he has to sit with it At the same time, this process is completely out of your control, and that's what makes it real. You're not forcing him to feel anything. You're not reminding him of your value. You're simply allowing your absence to speak for itself. And if the connection meant something to him, that silence will eventually create a response within him. But whether he acts on that feeling or not is a separate question. Because feeling your absence doesn't automatically lead to action. It simply creates awareness. And that awareness is what begins to shift his perspective. So while you stay focused on your own growth, understand that your absence is doing something powerful. It's showing him what your presence truly meant. When you step into no contact, there's an unspoken assumption that often sits beneath the surface. He expects you to remain the same. Not necessarily in a conscious or intentional way, but based on how things have always been. He remembers the version of you who was always available, who responded quickly, who gave energy freely, who stayed emotionally open even when things weren't consistent. And somewhere in his mind, there's a belief that when the silence ends, that same version of you will still be there, ready to continue where things left off. That expectation is rooted in familiarity. People get used to patterns, and once a pattern is established, it feels predictable. He knows how you usually respond, how you usually show up, how much you usually give. And because of that, he may not feel urgency to change anything on his side. He assumes the dynamic will simply reset when contact resumes. But this is where your growth becomes the most important factor. No contact is not just about silence. It's about transformation. It's about stepping away from the version of yourself that overgave, that tolerated inconsistency, that stayed even when things weren't aligned. It's about using that space to reflect, to understand your value, and to shift your mindset so you're no longer operating from the same emotional place. And when that growth is real, it changes how you show up when communication happens again. You're no longer reacting impulsively. You're no longer trying to secure the connection at all costs. You're no longer ignoring your own needs just to maintain closeness. Instead, you become more grounded, more aware, more selective with your energy. You don't give as quickly, not because you're playing a role, but because you understand that your time and attention are valuable. This shift can feel unexpected to him, because the version of you he was familiar with is no longer there in the same way. The dynamic he relied on doesn't automatically return, and that creates a moment of adjustment. He begins to realize that something has changed, not just in the situation, but in you. And that realization matters, because it forces him to see you differently. Not as someone who will always be there no matter what, but as someone who has boundaries, awareness, and self-respect. Someone who is no longer defined by the old pattern. At the same time, this growth protects you. It keeps you from slipping back into what once felt comfortable but wasn't healthy. It allows you to approach the connection with clarity instead of emotion, with intention instead of habit. Because the truth is, if you stay the same, the outcome stays the same. But when you evolve, the entire dynamic shifts. So don't return as the person he remembers. Return as the person you've become. When you've been consistently present in someone's life, when you've been easy to reach, easy to talk to, and always available in some way, a certain level of familiarity begins to form. And with that familiarity comes an unspoken assumption. Access to you feels natural, almost guaranteed. Not because it was earned every time, but because it was always there. He could reach out when he wanted, respond when it suited him, and still feel like the connection would remain open. That's the comfort of easy access. And during no contact, that's exactly what begins to change. When you step back and remove that availability, it interrupts that sense of certainty. Suddenly, the access he once had is no longer automatic. He can't just assume that he can come back into your space whenever he feels like it and find everything exactly as it was. And at first, this may not fully register. He might still operate from that old belief, thinking that whenever he decides to reach out, the door will be open in the same way. But as time passes and your silence continues, that assumption starts to weaken. because access, when it's no longer freely given, becomes something that has to be approached differently. He begins to recognize that your presence isn't something he can rely on without effort. And that realization shifts the way he views the connection. What once felt familiar now requires intention. This is where boundaries come into play. Not loud, not aggressive, but clear through your behavior. You're not explaining everything you expect. You're not setting rules in words. You're simply showing through your actions that your time and energy are not as easily available as they once were. You're no longer responding instantly every time. You're no longer engaging at the same level without seeing effort first. You're no longer allowing the dynamic to return to something that didn't serve you. And this kind of boundary is powerful because it doesn't come from resistance. It comes from self-respect. It communicates something without needing to be said, that access to you is something that should be valued, not assumed. And when that message is clear, it changes how he approaches you. If he wants to reconnect, if he wants to maintain communication, he has to show up differently. Not because you demanded it, but because the old way no longer works. At the same time, these boundaries protect you from falling back into the same cycle. They remind you that connection should be mutual, that effort should be consistent, and that your presence is not something to be given without awareness, because the moment you make yourself easily accessible again, without change, the dynamic resets. But when you hold your boundaries, the connection either rises to meet them, or it reveals that it can't. So don't make access easy. Make it meaningful. When a connection has a pattern where one person is consistently reaching out, initiating, and keeping the interaction alive, something subtle begins to form beneath the surface. Control, not in an obvious or manipulative way, but in the rhythm of the dynamic. The one who reaches out less often, who responds on their own time, who doesn't feel the need to maintain constant contact, naturally holds more control over the pace of the connection. And if you were the one who was always showing up, always checking in, always making sure the connection didn't fade, then without realizing it, you handed that control over. He didn't have to wonder when he would hear from you. He didn't have to think too much about maintaining the connection, because you were already doing that. The dynamic was predictable, and because of that, he stayed comfortable within it. But the moment you enter no contact and truly hold it, the control begins to shift. At first, he may not notice it right away. The absence feels like a pause, something temporary. He might assume that the same pattern will resume soon, that you will eventually step back into your role and reestablish the connection. But as the silence continues, that expectation starts to break down. And when it does, the control he once had begins to slip. Because now the rhythm is no longer predictable. He doesn't know when or if you'll reach out. He doesn't have the same sense of certainty about your availability. And that uncertainty creates a different experience for him. One where he's no longer passively receiving your effort, but actively noticing its absence. This is where the shift becomes real. When control is no longer in his hands, he becomes more aware of the connection itself. He starts to think more, to question more, to feel the difference between how things were and how they are now. Not because you're trying to make him feel something, but because the dynamic has changed in a way he can't ignore. And this is where your power grows. Not in controlling him, but in no longer being controlled by the pattern. You're no longer acting out of habit or emotional impulse. You're not reaching out just to ease the silence or to regain a sense of connection. You're staying grounded, allowing things to unfold without forcing them. And that steadiness is what shifts the balance. At the same time, this new dynamic gives you something you didn't have before: perspective. You can now observe without being pulled in. You can see how much effort he's willing to give without you initiating it. You can understand the connection based on reality, not just your contribution to it, because real connection doesn't rely on one person to keep it alive. It exists through mutual effort, shared responsibility, and balanced energy. So as control shifts, remember this, it's not about taking power over him, It's about finally taking it back for yourself. There's one expectation that often stays hidden beneath everything else during no contact. And it's this quiet belief that you'll still be there, not necessarily reaching out, not necessarily chasing, but waiting in some form. Waiting for him to be ready, waiting for him to come back, waiting for the right moment when everything finally aligns. And even if he never says it out loud, there's often a sense that when he decides to return, you'll still be emotionally available in the same way. This belief doesn't always come from arrogance. It often comes from familiarity. He's used to your presence, used to your consistency, used to the way you showed up before. So even in your absence, there's a part of him that assumes your place in his life hasn't truly changed. That when he comes back, things will pick up again. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough. But this is where the real transformation happens. When you stop waiting, because waiting keeps you emotionally tied to an outcome that hasn't happened yet. It keeps your focus on him, on his timing, on his decisions. And in that space, your growth becomes limited, your energy becomes stagnant, and your sense of control quietly slips away again. You may not be reaching out, but you're still holding on to the connection in a way that keeps you from fully moving forward. Choosing yourself breaks that completely. When you stop waiting, your focus shifts back to your own life. You start investing in your own growth, your own happiness, your own direction. You're no longer measuring time by when he might come back or wondering what he's thinking. You're creating a life that doesn't depend on his presence to feel complete. And this shift is powerful because it's real. It's not something you're doing to get a reaction from him. It's something you're doing for yourself. You're reclaiming your time, your energy, your emotional space. And in doing that, you remove the invisible expectation that you'll always be there in the same way. If he does come back, he won't find the same version of you waiting. He'll find someone who has grown, someone who has moved forward, someone who now chooses connection instead of needing it. And that changes everything about how he sees you and how you see the situation. At the same time, this mindset protects you from disappointment. Because you're no longer placing your hopes on his actions. You're not waiting for him to validate the connection or prove something to you. You're already grounded in your own sense of direction. And that's where true freedom comes from. Not in whether he returns, but in the fact that your life continues fully, with or without that outcome. So don't wait for him to come back. Choose yourself and let anything that returns meet you there.